This is the animation that we're gonna be making today, and we'll be using geometry nodes to do it. The original idea came from this account Polyhop, link in the description if you wanna check it out, and he mentions that it was created in Touch Designer. I'm Dude Blender, and let's do it in Blender. The basic logic to do this is actually quite simple. We're essentially gonna use a 4D noise texture to inform where to instance the cubes, and we'll use the fourth dimension, also known as time, to animate it. Also, it seems to be that there are two types of cubes, a solid black and a translucent white. The white ones have white edges, while the black ones seem to have color gradients. So I'm gonna take those ideas and do something slightly different, but that I think looks better, and it's also easier to do. I'm gonna delete this, and let's go ahead and add a cube. Go to the Geometry Nodes workspace, add a new tree, and let's rename this to cubes. This will be our grid of cubes, so we need to add points within the volume. Shift A, mesh to volume, plug it here, then Shift A, distribute, point it in volume, and we plug that here. We want an organized grid, so we change this from random to grid. In this reference, we can count 16 units per side, so we need to change the spacing of each point to fit all of our points. Since the cube is 2 meters long on each side, we're gonna divide it 2 by 16. If we go to top view, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then 8 more, it's 16. Alright, we have our grid. Now we'll need to instance small cubes in each point. To achieve the effect, we'll actually need 3 different types of cubes: the solid black, the translucent, and a wireframe. The idea is that we'll instance some black cubes, some translucent, and we'll also instance a wireframe on top of every cube. This way we'll give it more pizzazz. Let's pan this so that we can always see what we're doing. We're going to create a cube, move it a little bit to the right, and we can resize the cubes later, but we might as well just do it here. So press N to show this panel, and since we already made the operation here, we know that they need to be 12.5 centimeters per side. I'm going to duplicate this a couple of times, and always remember to rename your meshes. It's inconvenient at first, but it saves you a lot of time later. Cube black, cube white, cube wire. Now we need to select both the black and the white cubes, press M, and we're gonna move them to a new collection. We'll call this solid cubes. You'll see why we need the collection later in the video. Now let's add the materials. Solid black. I'll just use the default shader and change the color to black. You can change this to 0.75. For the translucent cube, let's go to the shading workspace, add a new material, translucent, and here we'll mix a translucent and a transparent shaders. Node Wrangler enable, Control Shift, right click and drag, and we get a mix shader. Connect this to the output. Let's go to rendered view and adjust the factor to whatever we like. I'll just leave it at 0.3. We can always come back to change this later. Also, I'm using a white color, but red or green also look cool. Then for wireframe, again, we add a new material, change the name, wireframe. Now we're gonna add a noise texture, again with the Node Wrangler enable, Control T to add these two nodes, and we're gonna change this to object. We will use a separate object as reference so that all of the gradients are applied as if all of the wireframes were one single object. Since we're gonna create this lattice, we might as well use that object. So let's add a cube. You'll see that it's not perfectly aligned to our grid, but we'll adjust the position later. Now let's rename this to lattice. Now let's tap into edit mode, select everything with A, Control E to show the edge menu, and subdivide. Expand this and change the number of cuts to 2. Now we can tap out of edit mode, go to modifiers, add a new modifier, wireframe. Now let's go to materials, we add a new material. Here we delete the principal BSDF, add an RGB, and we just plug that in directly. Now if I go to rendered view, you'll see that if we connect it in this way, we don't even need to worry about lighting later. Now let's go back to our cube wire, and here in object, just go ahead and select the lattice. We'll also add a wireframe modifier to this cube, but we'll change the thickness to 1 centimeter. Make sure that replace original and even thickness are checked. Now after the noise texture, we're gonna add a color ramp, and same as before, we're gonna delete the principal BSDF and connect the color ramp directly into the surface of the material output. Now let's add the colors that we want here. I'll use blue, red, yellow, and white. Now the noise texture outputs values from 0 to 1, but the vast majority of the values are within 0.3 and 0.7. So any colors behind this position will be ignored, as well as colors that are beyond this position. So make sure that your colors are within this range. Now let's change this from 3D to 4D, and we'll use the W to animate this later. Okay, now we've got everything we need to finish our geometry node tree. Let's go back to our geometry nodes workspace. Let's add a noise texture, and again we'll change this from 3D to 4D. Next we connect a color ramp. Now let's add an instance on points. We connect it here. You'll see that the points are gone now because there is nothing connected here. We're currently instancing nothing in those points. Let's bring the information of our cube wire into the editor by dragging and dropping from the outliner into the editor window. Now we connect the geometry to the instance. This happens because we forgot to apply the scale. So select the cube, Ctrl A, scale. And let's do that for the other cubes as well. Okay, let's go to front view. And now let's adjust the position of our lattice. Okay, now we have our 3D grid of cubes. If necessary, adjust the scale. That shouldn't be the case though, because we changed the size before. Now we want to use the noise texture to remove some of the cubes. So we're gonna connect the color ramp to selection. Now slide this marker to a position that removes enough cubes. You'll see that the cubes are very scattered. It's not forming groups like in this reference. Here you can see bundles of cubes forming together. This is because the scale of our texture is too large. So let's lower this to a point where we start to see that it forms bundles. Maybe something like this. I'm just gonna leave it at 1.3. So this is the main logic. We can scrub the W of our noise texture to see the animation. The 3D noise texture provides a value from 0 to 1 to every point in our 3D space. And with the color ramp, we're telling Blender to deselect every point wherever the noise texture is below this value. Now to add the solid cubes, we need a new instance on points node, so I'm gonna duplicate this. And since we want to instance solid cubes on the same points where we're instancing the wireframes, we just connect this same socket to this one. Now again with the node wrangler enabled, Ctrl Shift, right click and drag between these two to create a join geometry node. We also connect the color ramp to this selection. Now we're gonna bring the solid cubes collection into the editor. We connect instances to instance. You'll see that it's shifted, so check separate children, reset children, and pick instance. We can minimize this. Now the idea is that we want to tell Blender to make some of the cubes translucent and some of them black. Since we have a collection, we can add some logic to the instance index. And since we only have two elements in our collection, one of them will have the index of 0, the other one of 1. So we can use a math node and change this to compare. This node will output a boolean, so 0 or 1, which works perfectly for this application. So let's connect the value to instance index. We connect the color ramp to the value, change this value to 0, the epsilon to 0.05. I'm gonna change this to rendered. And now you can see that some of the cubes are black and some are translucent. If I change the epsilon value to a smaller number like 0.2, you see that now there are more black cubes. And if I increase it to something like 0.07, you see that there are more translucent. So this is the value that you want to modify to change the proportion between black and translucent cubes. I'm gonna change it back to 0.05. Also, let's go to world and change this to 0 so that we have a black background. Okay, one more thing that we need to fix is the color of the wireframes. These gradients are really not what we're looking for. So let's go back to shading, select our wireframe cube, and we want to change the scale of the noise texture. Let's lower this. Okay, this looks more like it. I'm just gonna leave the scale at 1. And here, if you want, you can adjust the colors to your liking. Last thing is to animate it. We need to animate the W to get this effect. Since we're lazy and we don't want to use any keyframes, we're just gonna use a driver. So Shift A, value, and in the value, hash frame. Next, connect this to a math node, divide, we connect this to the W. Divide this by something like 50. Now if we press spacebar to play the animation, you'll see that the colors are changing. Next, let's go to our geometry nodes workspace, and now we're going to animate this W. Shift A, scene time, and in the same way we connect the frame, math, divide, and this one to the W. Divide this one by 150 or so. And now if we play the animation, we can see the colors changing, and also the cube shapes are changing as well. Now the last thing we want to do is to select these cubes and make them invisible for the render. So go to Object Properties, Visibility, Show In, Renders. You could hide them from the viewport if you wanted to. The same with this one and this one. Now if I place my camera here and render, you can see that those cubes are gone. If you want, you can go here to the camera properties and change the type from perspective to orthographic, and now we're ready to render the animation. That's it for today's video. I'm Dude Blender. Happy blending.